tell you a couple of things that I can think of right offhand that changed in maybe 20 years or maybe even a little bit longer. I don't know how much you know about Navy Pier, but it used to be a pier that was used by the ships, and it had fallen into disrepair probably in the 60s or 70s. I don't really know, but in the 80s and 90s they started kind of renovating it, or they were putting some shops in there. They had a children's museum there, and then by the 2000s, and now it's just a big tourist attraction. The whole Navy Pier is lined with shops. Have you been there?
I've heard of it.
It's just lined with shops, and there's a big restaurant there. Well, several restaurants.
Is there an amusement park?
They have a big Ferris wheel there now, and tethered balloon rides. I mean, it's very bustling, and that whole area is just completely changed from, say, the 2000s back to the 60s or 70s, when it was pretty ramshackle and had fallen into disrepair. So that's a big change. It's cultural, social, and a landscape change, I would say. And other changes, I think the summers got drier the last few years that I was there. Although I don't know that that's a fact, it just seemed like it to me. That Chicago is very windy. It's known as a very windy city, and it still is a very windy city.
Do you think the winters have gotten harsher, or have there been more storms?
Well, the last few years I was there, I would say the storms were not as bad, because I can remember years with inches and inches and feet of snow. And that again would be back in the 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s, where we had just lots and lots of snow. I mean, the snow plows would pile it up, feet high. And in the early 2000s, so I left there in 2014, but I would say in the early 2000s, I don't think we had as dramatic snowstorms as earlier.
Okay.
What else can I think of? Stores that left Chicago, big name stores that were associated with Chicago for many years. Dominick's grocery store chain has left the suburbs in the Chicago area. Marshall Field's downtown was a big famous store, the department store downtown, that has left Chicago. And of course, the traffic has gotten worse.
Is there any difference in air pollution that you could tell, or
I
wildlife?
Probably can't tell, because I spent most of the last 30 years I was there, so I spent in the suburbs, so I wouldn't really be able to comment on the pollution in the city itself.
Okay.
Can't really say about that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had gotten worse. But
do you have anything you miss about living in Chicago from earlier on versus later, or more recently?
No, not really. Can't think of anything that I did early in my years in Chicago that I missed or didn't do in my later years. It was going downtown to Chicago for shows or theater, or even to go see a Cubs baseball game. Always took a long time. It would take at least an hour by train, or you'd fight the traffic, and that would still take an hour by car. So in that respect, things didn't really change. My friends and I, we still did the same things. We just, I can't really say anything I know for certain or feel for certain that it changed.
Okay. Well, what about light pollution?
Good question. There's a lot of it, even that extends even out 20 or 30 miles into the suburbs too. And I probably didn't notice that as much. I knew it was a fact, but I didn't notice it until in hindsight, after I moved to South Central Indiana and could see, oh, look at all these stars. Then in hindsight, I realized how much light pollution there was in the Chicago area. Yes.
But did you see changes like during your time there, or did you just not really notice
I probably didn't even really pay attention.
It was probably very gradual too.
Probably, so that I just knew it was a fact and didn't pay attention to whether it was getting worse or not.
Okay, well, I think I don't have any more questions prepared, but if you would like to comment on anything else about Chicago.
I wish I could. Honestly, since I spent, as I said, the last many years that I was there in the suburbs and not in the city per se, so I was paying more attention to what was going on in the little suburbs that I was in.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Well, I guess this doesn't have to be limited just to the city. So if you have any observations about the suburbs.
Well, one general observation, probably just about Illinois in general, from northern Illinois through central Illinois, Chicago on down. A lot of the farmland was disappearing because there weren't as many small farmers or family farms, and corporations and big businesses were taking over a lot of the farmland. So there were a lot of new housing developments being built as the farmland got sold, and then developers would buy it up to build houses. So farmland was disappearing.
Was it like farming for crops or like livestock?
Mostly crops that I was aware of. The flat land and the fertile black soil that they had there was very good for corn and soybeans. So mostly crops.
Okay. Cool. I was going to say something, I think. Oh yeah, since you didn't say this before in the recording, can you give me a brief overview of when you spent your time in Chicago and when you moved, just so it can be in
the timeline, you mean?
Yeah, the timeline.
Well, I grew up in Illinois, in Champaign, Illinois, and went to the University of Illinois, and then I moved to Chicago in 1969, and I lived in the city from 1969 to 1974, and then I moved out to the suburbs in late 74, and I stayed in the suburbs of Chicago until I came to Bloomington, Indiana in 2014. So I'll be just 5 years living in the city of Chicago itself, but I taught school in the city of Chicago for 35 years, but was living out in the suburbs for most of that time.
Okay. Do you have any other interesting observations about the city versus the suburbs, besides the typical differences?
I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at. The city is in the early years that I was in the city, and even the early years after I moved out, but was still commuting to the city, I didn't see as many bike riders in the city as I would see, bike riders or walkers, as I would see out in the suburbs. But I think that has changed now. I think in the city there's a lot more, bike paths have been built in the city of Chicago, so there's biking you see that a lot around the lakefront and so forth. But I think maybe in the 70s, I'm just surmising here because I really don't know, but I would see more people walking or riding bikes in the suburbs than I did in the city, but I don't think that's necessarily true anymore.
Okay, that's interesting because I always just felt like public transportation in the cities is like a more popular thing, and so people will walk around more, and in the suburbs, since everything's spaced out, like people just drive. I guess that's true here.
You're right. People would drive to work more in the suburbs or drive to maybe shopping malls, but just around the neighborhoods.
Okay.
There was a lot of walking and biking in the neighborhoods, but true, they did have to drive their cars to go to work or drive their cars to go to the shopping malls or the grocery stores. Whereas in the city, people were, I walked to a grocery store, but I still drove to work. I just think maybe I'm talking about recreational bike riding.
Okay.
I think is more prevalent in Chicago now than it was when I was first living there.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing this interview.
You're welcome.
I'll stop the recording.